Hi, Brad. Hello, Nicholas. Hi, everyone. Let me try to add Brad in the call.
There we go. Oh,
Hello.
hello. Working on it. Oh, am I sideways? I need to be the other way, huh?
Exactly.
Okay.
Perfect.
Gotcha. I guess I have to, yeah, get rid of these. I think you can hear me fine on the iPhone without those.
Yeah, I can hear you actually now.
Great. Great.
How are you?
Good. How?
Actually, there is some. There is some echo actually from. So maybe uh, either I need to put some
Here, maybe I just need to, maybe I
headset.
just need to hold it. I think it was, yeah. Is that
Okay.
better?
Yeah, actually, it seems. Yeah, great stuff.
Great. That's
Uh,
fine.
Okie dokie. So uh, let's start a bit with introductions. How are you, first of all? How was your July since we last talked? How's everything?
Everything is good. July was busy. There's a lot of just festivals, people visiting, kind of a blur, honestly. I did go to a friend's memorial service. Unfortunately, one of my best friends passed of pancreatic cancer at the age of 46, or 47. So that was a sad moment in the early part of the month. So I had to drive. I drove to Maine, which is, believe it or not, where I live in New York to Maine, which is also in the Northeast U.S., but it's like a 12-hour one-way drive. It's crazy. It doesn't seem like it should be that far, but it is. but
Okay.
yeah, but we got through that, and now I'm kind of like, yeah, July is always a whirlwind, and now I'm kind of digging back in, and yeah, getting back at it. How
Well,
about you?
sorry for your friends, first of all. I lost my dad due to the same reason.
Right.
I mean, different age, obviously, age range, but still, it's tough to see it happen.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So okay, cool. So I mean, I know you have been doing a lot of work recently around well, shaping up your theory of obesity, the cause of obesity, which I would like to discuss a bit more about.
Yeah.
And also when it comes to calories in, calories out, what it means to you. I actually think that, and I don't practice with anyone whom I work with calories in, calories out. I think it's a broken model, but maybe you can explain to us why in the course of this chat. And okay, as usual, I will say that let's see if we can keep it high level, so for everyone to connect with this discussion we're gonna have. So, and I wanted to bring in one example of a person which I'm currently working with. Maybe he's in the call as well. Who I think is a good example for this chat. So he's a person. When I started working with him, he was 115 kilos,
Yep.
diabetic. So blood sugars when we started of with medication, etc., fasting glucose around 150,
Okay.
etc. So maybe let's start with how do you define his, so what are the state, what is the state that he's actually in? So you have a lot of let's say markers which you're actually constantly highlighting, like high NADH to NAD plus ratio.
Right.
So maybe what would we typically see in that particular individual? And then we can continue.
Right. So one thing that is very uh, I don't know, diagnostic, or one thing that you see in obesity and diabetes is you see a high amount of circulating lactate in the bloodstream.
Hmm.
And the reason for that is that when cells essentially accumulate, I'm going to say, to sort of lead into the electrons in, electrons out idea, cells essentially accumulate electrons, and those electrons are basically stored in NADH. NADH is an electron carrier, they call it. And so what happens is the cells build up with these electrons and they don't have anywhere for it to go. And so one of the things that they can do with it is when glucose comes in, it gets split into two. It gets split into two molecules of pyruvate, and pyruvate can be it can be changed into lactate and exported out of the cell. And what happens is when the cells convert pyruvate to lactate, they give it a couple of those electrons, and so that conversion of pyruvate to lactate is a way for the cell to offload some of those extra electrons, and so the cells can actually take in pyruvate out of the bloodstream, convert them to lactate, and then export them. And so the ratio of lactate to pyruvate winds up sort of matching the NADH to NAD plus ratio in all of the tissues, and the body can equilibrate all that by basically dumping the extra electrons off on pyruvate to turn it into lactate. And so then when you look at obese people, they have a lot of circulating lactate because, or diabetic people, because they have all these extra electrons and then they don't have anywhere for them to go. And so all of the tissues are kind of trying to dump it off into the bloodstream as lactate, and you see lactate levels rise in those people. And also what happens is if you have to keep converting all of the pyruvate into lactate. Pyruvate is the thing that comes from glucose and goes into the mitochondria to get burned.
Yeah.
And so the other thing you see, of course, in diabetes is people are not good at burning blood sugar, and that is because they're too high in this NADH, and they're converting all their pyruvate into lactate, and pyruvate dehydrogenase, which is the kind of limiting factor to burning glucose, is not functioning, and that's one of the reasons you're getting this buildup of lactate and NADH.
Okay. So, I mean, for you, it's high levels of lactates, that's measurable, and also high levels of NADH compared to NAD.
Right.
And that basically creates an inability, as just paraphrasing some of your articles, to first of all to burn glucose, right?
Yeah.
But also the inability to lower fatty acids. So
Right.
why is that important? So and just we're still at the state of that person starting his journey, and I would like to kind of discuss with you where he is now and what's the difference.
Sure.
But then that inability to lower free fatty acids probably comes from a mixed diet, high in fats and high in glucose. Because there we don't only have an ability to burn fat, we have an ability to burn fat and glucose together. It's kind of, we have starving cells in a way, right?
Right. Yes. And so, and so one of the things that insulin does is so like you say, if you eat a meal that's high in carbohydrate, that stimulates insulin, and insulin turns off lipolysis, or it doesn't turn it totally off, but it downregulates lipolysis. Lipolysis is how fat cells release fat to sort of feed the rest of the body, right? And so the fat cells can release these free fatty acids, and insulin, turns that process down, in response to eating starch or glucose, Anyway, Sorry. And so you were,
you're trying to navigate your thoughts, I think.
yeah,
Uh,
I was trying to
uh,
remember what your question was now.
no, the question was why do we end up with inability of lowering fatty acids? Because
Right. So, yeah. And so, the question of in, in, um, why in diabetes we lose the ability to control fatty acid release it's kind of complicated, and I don't really know the answer. A lot of people have speculated that there becomes a structural issue in the fat cells, so that you can imagine that if you are, if you have this overload of energy, um, becoming fatter is actually kind of protective, because you have this, you have this extra energy being produced, and you're making extra fat because you're doing de novo lipogenesis. And if you can just store that in your fat cells, then um,
it's a protective mechanism.
you're obese, but you're kind of protecting against some of the dangerous aspects of what ultimately becomes diabetes. And then at some point, there's a limit to sort of how big fat cells can get, and when they go past that limit, there's a I can't remember. There's a structural issue. There's another enzyme that happens. I can't think of the name of it, and that's when the fat cells just start giving off, doing this lipolysis all the time in a kind of unconstrained way. And that is really one of the hallmark features of kind of full-blown type 2 diabetes is
Yeah,
just continual release of free fatty acids into the bloodstream. And that, once that happens, it kind of, you kind of get stuck in that. There are ways to get out of it, I think, but it's easy to
so
get stuck in that zone.
yeah, exactly. And I think well, actually, I think what I found with, let's say, for this particular individual, right, or with many slash most of the people that I work with, is now we're 6 weeks, 6 7 weeks into his journey. So he's lost 13 kilos.
Right.
And I was just noting his percentages now where he is. So mostly we're doing a low carb diet, and he's currently doing round about 50 grams of carbs, 100 grams of fat, and 120 grams of protein. So highest protein, highest fat, and low carb.
Right.
So, and that, if you just add it up, it makes around about 1,600 calories. So obviously, I don't want to get into discussion if it's accurate or if it's not accurate, but this person is actually counting every day pretty without missing any days, all his daily intake in a chronometer.
Right.
So let's assume it's relatively accurate. So this person now has shifted, has lost a lot of kilos. He's now slowly starting to get into ketosis. His blood sugars, most importantly, have fallen from 150 fasting glucose to 100.
Oh, that's great.
So what has actually shifted in this? So maybe you want to go in any direction. So why does he see improved glucose tolerance? Or maybe why has he lost so many kilos? Is it calorie restriction of calories, or what is it really?
Right.
Where
And
would
so,
you?
right. And so, not to, like I say, I'm a calories in, calories out is not, it's not really right. And it's, on another way, it's not entirely wrong. I mean, it's kind of right. It's kind of wrong.
Okay.
1,600 calories is fairly, that's pretty restrictive of calories for an adult. I mean, I don't know how old he is, but
He's around 50 years old.
right. So I mean, and again, I don't know how big he is and all that, but typically an adult male of around 50, I think, would consume closer to 3,000 calories as a full thing. But I do think that by by going to a low carb route, I do think that can help significantly with ironically, going low carb. One of the things that it does is you do have an increase of free fatty acids, and I think that can help suppress hunger.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can help, that can definitely help put you on track of weight loss. There's a lot happening. I think that in a lot of ways, I mean, keto dieting and low carb dieting is obviously it's hugely beneficial to a lot of people, and I've done it a lot in my life and gotten great benefit from it. It's not really the focus of my research, so I don't want to pretend to be an expert on it, because I'm really not. What I'm looking at is sort of like, I know that, so one of the hallmarks, as I've said, of obesity and diabetes is we lose the ability to oxidize glucose, right? We lose pyruvate dehydrogenase function. So I'm very curious about why that is, because I think, to me, keto is great, and obviously it's helping tons of people, and I think that's wonderful. But I'm sort of trying to figure out, like, to me, it's sort of keto still doesn't get you to efficiently use dietary glucose, right? You have to stay keto or it stops working. And so where my head is and my research is is there a way, once you've sort of lost that ability to efficiently burn glucose, to kind of get that back?
Exactly.
And so, yeah, there's lots of cases of keto working, and that's great, but it's sort of not like, it obviously works. But I'm sort of,
I don't, Bharat, I don't want to guide your thoughts through my thoughts. I mean,
sure,
feel free to answer in any way you want.
sure,
I'm trying to lead that, because again, I don't consider keto the end goal, right? So
right,
you are in keto and you want to be in keto forever. I consider more metabolic flexibility, that we need to be able to use efficiently glucose as well.
right.
So maybe the question, if I would rephrase it, if that makes it easier for you, is, okay, so could we have the same results with that particular individual if we followed a different particular type of diet? So if we still kept the glucose higher, but we still were able to increase his glucose burning, or so?
Well, I think so, and I think, I believe that we can, and that,
Okay.
but it's also, we're still trying to figure out how to do that, and it's tricky. And so, like I say, one of the issues is, why can't we burn glucose? Let's start there. And so,
Okay.
one of the issues is, as I've already mentioned, it is pyruvate dehydrogenase. And so that enzyme is very central and crucial to our metabolism. What it does is it takes, glucose comes into the cell, we break it down into pyruvate, and that is all part of glycolysis. So that doesn't use any oxygen. And so that's what cancer cells do, a lot of glycolysis. And so what you see in cancer cells is they also give off a lot of lactate, because they're doing a lot of this glycolysis, and they're doing a lower percentage of oxidative burning of glucose. And you see the same thing in obese and diabetic people. And so pyruvate dehydrogenase is directly inhibited by NADH, and it's directly inhibited by acetyl-CoA, which are the kind of extra energy that builds up in the cell. And when that happens, suddenly, so what pyruvate dehydrogenase does is it takes that pyruvate and it turns it into acetyl-CoA. And from that point on, it can go into the mitochondria and it gets burned oxidatively, right? So now we're consuming oxygen, and we're getting rid of the glucose. We're burning the pyruvate instead of, having glucose and lactate build up in our bloodstream. Once we get pyruvate dehydrogenase working, now everything is burning cleanly again. And so one of the things that I noticed, or this sort of become apparent recently, and this is why I posted on Twitter the thing about it's not really calories in, calories out, it's electrons in, electrons out, is that, so a lot of the thing I've talked about on my blog is when we're burning fat, we're making a lot of reactive oxygen species. And okay, so what is that? Reactive oxygen species means that some of these extra, right, I've said there's extra electrons built up in the cell, and they're in NADH, which is carrying these electrons around. And essentially the electrons, however you want to say it, they get loose. In the mitochondria, most of the electrons are flowing through this electron transport chain, and it's making ATP, and that's our source of energy. But some of them get loose and they form superoxide, and that makes hydrogen peroxide. And we have this whole detoxification system that can help us get rid of these reactive oxygen species. And so for a long time, this has always been portrayed as something that happens when we're burning fat. Saturated fat in particular generates a lot of these reactive oxygen species, which, when it's happening in a controlled fashion and we're dealing with it gracefully, we have this whole antioxidant system, glutathione, and the enzymes that go along with it will step in, get rid of those reactive oxygen species, and that actually increases our metabolic rate. It gets rid of these extra electrons because they're jumping to oxygen. It's essentially a way of burning more oxygen. It's a way of getting oxidation of the fats burning more efficiently when we are generating the ROS and then rapidly eliminating them. But what's come to the forefront recently is that 3 other enzymes, and especially pyruvate dehydrogenase, also, as it's working, generates reactive oxygen species. And so this is fairly new. Probably within the last 10 years, people have figured this out. And so it turns out that this production of reactive oxygen species is not confined to fat. Whether or not we're burning carbohydrate or fat, we're creating these reactive oxygen species. So it seems to be a sort of fundamental part of, it's a very fundamental part of our metabolism. And essentially what it's doing is it's burning more oxygen. It's a way to get rid of electrons by burning oxygen. And it just helps our whole metabolism go. And so what happens is, I think, when we're eating certain foods, and specifically I mean polyunsaturated fats, that seems to be the only nutrient that we consume where we're generating less of these reactive oxygen species. And so if you eat a bunch of corn oil or soybean oil, suddenly production of the ROS goes down. That means we're literally burning less oxygen now. And so the whole system in the mitochondria starts to slow down, and we start to have buildup of this NADH because there's nowhere for the electrons to go. The reactive oxygen species is essentially, it's like a pressure relief valve when energy in the mitochondria gets too high. That's a system we use to get rid of the excess energy. And certain things, such as polyunsaturated fat, kind of break that system. Then NADH starts to build up, and acetyl-CoA starts to build up. And once that happens, the problem is that our mitochondrial enzymes are directly inhibited by a buildup of acetyl-CoA, especially. So our mitochondrial enzymes can be turned off by acetylation. And that
Mhm.
means that, so all of our food is broken down into acetyl-CoA, and the acetyl groups from the acetyl-CoA just kind of automatically uh, stick onto our enzymes, and it makes acetylated enzymes. And the acetylated enzymes don't work. So mitochondrial complex 1 and 4, and I think others, as the acetyl groups build up, they literally can't work anymore. They get acetylated and they're basically out of commission. And so when that happens, that's when you start to see real problems. That's when you see metabolic rate drop. That's when, okay, now we can't burn, like the rise in NADH and the rise in acetyl-CoA is very effective at shutting off pyruvate dehydrogenase. And so that's sort of the first hit, is pyruvate dehydrogenase stops working. That's when we lose the ability to efficiently burn glucose. But then now we're sort of burning all fat. Fat is very rich in acetyl groups, and if we're not burning the right kinds of fats, and that's, I think, the key thing. If we're not burning the right kinds of fats, the acetyl groups can build up even higher, and then the whole mitochondrial machinery gets shut down when the acetyl groups get high enough. And that's when we also stop burning fat as efficiently. So I think that's how the problem starts, right? You kind of have this steady, this is all happening within the mitochondria, and you just simply have this steady buildup of NADH and acetyl-CoA until the whole system kind of shuts down. And so then the question for us is, how do we fix that?
Mhm.
Right? And so obviously, one of the things that happens is, and this makes sense from the cell. So from the cell, what does this look like? If you have a buildup of NADH and acetyl-CoA, it looks like there's too much energy around. And so the other thing is, I've said that all these mitochondrial enzymes are shut down by acetylation, but the enzymes that control de novo lipogenesis, so, which just means making new fat, is actually turned on by acetylation. So SREBP1C is this transcription factor that kind of controls most of the enzymes involved in de novo lipogenesis, making new fat.
Mhm.
And when it gets acetylated, it's actually activated. Unlike the mitochondrial enzymes, when they get acetylated, they get turned off. And so this rising of acetyl-CoA in the mitochondria, which really is just representing rising energy, is a switch that turns off metabolism, and it turns on fat production, because the body says, well, I guess we have enough energy, let's convert the extra into fat. And so I think that when you go, and a lot of what gets made into fat is glucose that's coming in. And so I think that one of the reasons that the low carb diet is so effective is, if you're eliminating glucose, you're sort of eliminating the fuel to do this de novo lipogenesis. And so that, that's really helpful, in that scenario, when you have a lot of acetyl-CoA buildup, a lot of NADH, you're doing a lot of de novo lipogenesis, and we say, okay, let's remove the fuel to do this de novo lipogenesis, and that can go a long ways to helping us lose weight and helping us deal with a lot of the issues.
Okay.
But it still doesn't make us metabolically flexible. It still doesn't make us efficient, sort of like glucose burners, like healthy people are, or like lean people are, that are not struggling with metabolic issues and diabetes, etc.
Okay. So I'm not sure which direction we
Yeah.
should go now,
Sorry,
but
that was a lot.
that was a lot. But for me, so let's close the keto chapter, and we'll go to the glucose chapter maybe. So if, for example, me as well, or any person doing keto, or a person trying to lose the kilos on keto, if they followed a diet which is high in PUFA, as you alluded to, would they actually, would there be mechanisms that, or would their weight loss stall? So is PUFA a factor here in this type of diet, or PUFA or lactic acid becomes more a predominant factor in a mixed type of diet?
Well, I think there is, and I'm not an expert on keto, but just looking at message boards and like what people have told me, a very common thing I hear is that people on keto will stall with weight loss if they eat a lot of nuts. That's a thing that I've heard from any number of
That
people.
has happened. I know it firsthand as well.
Right, and so nuts are one of the main. Right, and so then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, the system evolved the way that it did for a reason, right? It didn't just
happen.
come out. It didn't just happen this way, right? And so
Yeah.
so what are nuts? And you look at, okay, well, animals, that are getting ready for winter, they eat a lot of acorns, and acorns are high in oil, and nuts too. Acorns are high in oil, and it's very unsaturated oil. It's typically pretty high in PUFA. It's high in monounsaturated fats as well, and it's very low in saturated fats, and especially stearic acid. And so I think eating a lot of those kinds of fats can even once you've taken away most of the glucose as sort of fuel for this de novo lipogenesis, I think if you're eating a lot of very unsaturated fats, you can still counteract the effects of keto. I mean, I think one of the things about keto is that people aren't eating a lot of like you're sort of naturally not eating a lot of vegetable oil as well, because
You're not.
Usually the vegetable oils are used to cook whatever they're used to cook,
Fries,
potatoes or
etc. Yeah.
vegetables. So you sort of
Yeah. Chicken
automatically
wing.
remove the vegetable oils without trying, because I don't know what I mean, I guess you could eat mayonnaise on your steak or something, but I think most people don't do that.
Usually butter.
Right.
Okay. So
Right.
okay. So yeah, probably it might be a problem, but then let's move to the glucose. Let's say path, which you seem to be more interested in. So okay. So how does then a mixed diet? Because here, even if we're talking about healthy or non-healthy people, I think that maybe the effect is different, but still you're going down the problematic path if you're not watching out what you eat or how you construct that mixed diet, right?
Right.
So for example, Paul Saladino argues, okay, only eat saturated fats, nothing else, plus a tons of sugar, and you'll stay metabolic health. So it's not the same statement as if you would say eat plenty of fat and any type of fat and plenty of sugar with any type of sugar, right?
Right.
So
Right.
how do we break the system basically?
Right. Well, so I'm not a big. I'm personally not a big fan of sugar. I don't think a little sugar is the end of the world. I actually think that looking around, you can find a lot. There's a lot of metabolically healthy cultures around the world who eat primarily starch.
Mm-hmm.
I see less, and I'm talking like cultures where perhaps 85% of calories are from starch and they still stay metabolically healthy. I don't think you can say the same thing about sugar. And that's, there's an anecdote I wrote about on my blog, and someone, a European in the US, who was, witnessing the Native Americans, while they were still, living very traditional lifestyles, noted that certain Native Americans during maple sugaring season, Native Americans in the northeast part of America and in the northern part of America would get a pretty high percentage of their calories from maple sugar. That was the big activity that they did in winter. And, the comment was that some Native Americans would eat only maple sugar, and that those were the only fat Native Americans that he saw. And so, I think there's enough anecdotes that I don't love the idea of eating a large amount of sugar. Sugar increases SCD1, which is an enzyme that makes your fat more unsaturated. And so I'm still on the on the path that I think if you want to eat carbohydrate, starch is a better option than sugar. That's number one. Number two is that I think when you look at lean people, if they eat a mixed meal of, say, of starch and fat, they very preferentially oxidize the glucose first. So a lean person, you give them potatoes with butter on it, they very rapidly oxidize the glucose from the starch from those potatoes. And then when the glucose is gone, they switch back to burning the fat, the butter that was in those potatoes. An obese person is not nearly as good at that. In an obese person, if you give them the same meal, potatoes with butter, they don't burn the glucose as well. So they don't, they continue to burn a lot higher percentage of fat as they burn that glucose. And so they've sort of lost, and so that's where you lose the metabolic flexibility. The obese person is just simply not as good at burning glucose in response to a mixed fat meal. But so that's physiologically, but also the type of fat that you eat makes a huge difference. So it's a well-known fact that if you eat a mixed, starch and fat meal that's high in polyunsaturated fat like soybean oil, or even high in monounsaturated fat like olive oil, after the meal, you will burn a lot less glucose and a lot more fat if you've eaten the polyunsaturated fat or the monounsaturated fat. And so, metabolically, a mixed meal of starch and unsaturated fat makes you process the meal more like an obese person rather than the way that a lean person would. And so, so to me, when I look at all of these studies showing that, and of course, a lot of people look at these studies and say, "Oh, this is great. If you eat soybean oil, you'll burn more fat after a meal." To which I would respond, "Yes, just like obese people do." And so I think there's something really wrong with that. I think that if you eat a mixed meal of starch and fat, and if you don't switch over to burning mostly starch, I think that's a big problem. And I think that's actually a small indicator of the root cause of the problem of these vegetable oils ultimately leading to this metabolic dysfunction, is that the vegetable oils are essentially taking away your metabolic flexibility. They're taking away your ability to burn glucose. And the way that they're doing that is vegetable oils stimulate the enzymes such as PPAR alpha. PPAR alpha is not really an enzyme. It's a transcription factor. But anyways, it controls a lot of the enzymes that upregulate fat metabolism. And so vegetable oils are very actively kicking you out of glucose burning by stimulating PPAR alpha and all of its downstream target enzymes. And so I think that's bad. I think that if you want to eat a mixed diet and remain healthy, you need to prioritize the burning of the glucose. And I think that's the beginning of the problems of vegetable oils. And so, interestingly, the fat that resists this the most is stearic acid, which I talk a lot on my website. Stearic acid is very slow to be absorbed. It's very slowly transported and enters the mitochondria very slowly. And so stearic acid sort of gets out of the way and allows you to burn glucose, whereas the vegetable oils are, jumping the line and wanting to burn first, and therefore preventing you from burning glucose. So I've made the analogy that stearic acid is sort of like the fiber of the fat world. It kind of, slows everything down. It gives you a slower, more steady burn. It allows you to burn the fuel more completely. You get, one of the things you see in diabetes and obesity, when you look at in the blood of the person, in addition to high lactate, you also see a lot of acyl carnitine. You see a buildup of acyl carnitines. Acyl just means fat, and carnitine is the molecule that shuttles fat into the mitochondria. And so whenever you see an acyl carnitine in the bloodstream, that is a molecule of fat that was sent into the mitochondria to be burned. And for whatever reason, it didn't burn, and it's now back floating around in the bloodstream. And so whenever you see a buildup of acyl carnitines, that's telling you that you're not burning fat to completion. Something is happening in the mitochondria. The fat isn't burning, and it's winding up being recirculated to see if another tissue can take it in and burn it. And so, and so I think that's the vegetable oils taking that premature spot in the line, and they're not driving ROS. They end up, I say they burn dirty, right? They're not. It's sort of like black smoke out of your tailpipe. Whereas stearic acid slows the entry of fat into the mitochondria, it generates more ROS, and it's measuring. It's coming into the mitochondria at a pace where it can be fully oxidized, and you can take in enough oxygen to burn it cleanly, and you're not ejecting all of this partially burned fuel back into the bloodstream. And it's allowing the glucose to be burned first and be burned preferentially before it comes in. And so I do think there are huge differences. I mean, there are huge differences, and you can show it very acutely. Here's a good example. So somebody did a study where they took these, I think they were trained athletes. They were in college, or they were young people, and they gave one of them they gave him this like drink that was high in fat. And so one of them basically were sipping on soybean oil all morning, and the other ones were sipping on cream all morning. And then they had them do this exercise bike. And the people who had consumed cream all morning, and it was a lot, it was like 2,000 calories or 2,500 calories of pure fat, basically, that they had sipped in the 4 hours leading up to this exercise. And the ones who had sipped the cream or drunk the cream, when they started to exercise, you saw this huge increase in pyruvate dehydrogenase activity. So you saw that they were like, okay, we need energy, let's burn some glucose. The people who consume the soybean oil leading up to the exercise, they had no rise in pyruvate dehydrogenase activity. So the vegetable oil had completely blocked their ability to burn more glucose in response to exercising. And so the vegetable oil had directly blocked their metabolic flexibility.
And what were they burning then?
Well, they were burning fat. They were burning essentially pure fat, which is, which sounds good. It sounds good.
Yeah,
a lot
what
of
you
people on
said
lean
before.
diet, they're like, oh, that's great. That's what we want to do, is burn pure fat. Except that that's not what lean people do. lean people are very metabolically flexible, and whenever they need a burst of energy, they can burn glucose. And that's what's lost in obesity and diabetes. And vegetable oil sort of gets you there a lot more directly than becoming diabetic.
Having said that, though, if you wake up and you just walk around or you do some low intensity exercise, walking, shopping, whatever, then
Right.
in a fasted state, then you're primarily, as a metabolic healthy person, you're primarily burning fat. So your fat oxidation is, let's say, at 80% compared to 20% of glucose oxidation. Just
Right. No,
because,
true.
yeah.
Yes. No, absolutely true. Absolutely true. But in so in the fasted state, yes, you should be burning fat. And that's true of, I think that's true of everyone. I think both healthy people and um,
Yeah.
obese and diabetic are all essentially burning mostly fat in the fasted state. When they're, like you say, when they're walking around, when you're doing sort of moderate paced activities, totally true. But the difference is that the lean people, once they start to do vigorous exercise, that's when they will, start burning extra glucose if it's available, to help with that, just to provide extra power and whatever is necessary for the exercise. Obese and diabetic people can't do that. They don't have access. They don't have access to that glucose, and that
Exactly.
really metabolically is a huge difference, I think.
Actually, that's I tend to believe actually that we should all be doing some sort of I don't know what's the right word now, ergometric, where you actually measure your under some certain different variable of stress, exercise, your fat oxidation and glucose oxidation, and that's actually the best indicator to see how healthy or metabolically healthy you are.
I
So you should be
100% agree with that statement. Absolutely. And no, I think that's spot on. I think, and I think a lot of people are very interested in like continuous glucose monitors.
Yep.
And I'm not totally sold on them because the problem is it doesn't tell you what you're doing with the glucose. You could be very good at controlling your blood glucose by turning it all into fat. You know what I mean? Or turning
Exactly.
a high percentage of it into fat. Like, you don't know if you don't know what I think the respiratory exchange ratio is what you were kind of talking about there. You don't know
Yeah.
whether or not you don't know if you're burning the glucose. You know it, like you could be turning, like, right, because the glucose can either be stored as glycogen, or it can be turned into fat, or you can burn it, or you can just convert it all to lactate, and lactate levels can rise. And so just because you have a reasonable area under the curve doesn't mean that you actually burned the glucose. It has a lot of different places it can go.
Well, diabetics or typically have lactate levels of round about 2. So
Yeah, that's
whereas a healthy person is probably below 1 or so.
yeah.
So and 2 is the cutoff usually for when you start losing the ability to circulate it, I guess, or losing the ability to recirculate it for energy. So
Yeah, and
yeah,
like I say, the lactate to pyruvate ratio, and the problem is we don't, most of the studies you see, and most of the, like, I have a lactate tester, but it doesn't tell me the pyruvate. But if you know that ratio of lactate to pyruvate, then you know the cytoplasmic ratio of NADH to NAD plus, because they're almost always the same. And so, but when you see that lactate build up, yeah, it's probably a sign that you have too much
yeah.
NADH, and the cells are trying to do something with it, and so they're just cranking out lactate to try to get rid of the NADH.
But let's go back to calories in, calories out, if I may. And
Absolutely.
but we're going with through one step more. And so because we're talking, okay, at the end we want to solve, or your interest is in solving or giving some answers to the hallmark of obesity, right? So in order
Right.
to resolve the obesity, we need to, I guess, lose the kilos. I typically see with people who are insulin resistant that they have high insulin levels. And that insulin, they become insulin sensitive, so they, again, bring down their insulin levels. It takes time. So 6 months, a year, whatever. It really takes time.
Right.
But then what happens with NADH and NAD levels? So we want to bring down that ratio, right? Because that's a key marker. So we want to be able to be more efficient in oxidizing, well, as you said, eating glucose. So how long does, I don't want to, I don't know if it's correlated with insulin levels themselves, but how long does it take really to balance that? And then where does energy come, right? Because we say that's too much energy. So do we need to reduce energy in order to correct that ratio? Or how would you approach it now, leading into the calories topic?
Right. Right. So calories is sorry, and this is what I was mentioning on Twitter the other day. Calories is sort of an indicator of electrons in our food. So the whole reason that the food has energy is that you have these electrons that are shared between hydrogen and carbon in both fat and glucose. This is true. And when those electrons from the hydrogen and the carbon flow back to oxygen, which is what happens in the mitochondria, and then you release CO2 and H2O. So what happened is the carbon and the hydrogen went from being bound to each other, and in the forms of CO2 and H2O, they're both bound entirely to oxygen. And when that happens, there's this release of energy because the electrons are essentially happier bound to oxygen, and it gives off energy to do that. And so each of those pairs of electrons makes another NADH. And in terms of calories that you consumed versus calories that you burn, they shouldn't necessarily, like, we have we have all these mechanisms that should prevent any individual cell from having too much energy at any moment, right? Just because you ate a lot of calories shouldn't mean that any given mitochondria, for instance, should be overloaded with energy. And so you can, if you have a healthy metabolism, you can, you can have a feast and it's okay. You're not putting yourself, and even there are cultures in Africa where the young men will purposefully fatten up to show that they have access to wealth, and to try to get a bride. And so they do these. There's a thing called the Guru Walla, where men will eat up to 12,000 calories a day for a number of months,
Well,
to bulk up, to kind of show their wealth, and they're from a prominent family, and that helps them get a bride. And then as soon as they stop, purposefully eating that number of calories,
we lost you.
and
Okay, you're back.
within a
You're
year
back.
or two. And so
Okay.
I don't think that excess calories should necessarily lead to this kind of problem in the mitochondria. Because obviously there's all kinds of gating factors about how energy gets into the mitochondria, right? But what happens is in obesity and diabetes is you do inevitably have this buildup of NADH in the mitochondria, and that NADH is really just, like I said, the NADH are just electron carriers. So these energetic electrons from your food are building up in there. And so once that happens, once the NADH builds up, that's when you start, you know, losing, again, you lose the ability to efficiently burn glucose. And so that's really where the rubber hits the road, is how do we prevent this kind of buildup of these electrons in the form of NADH in our cells. That is ultimately the thing that gums up our metabolism, slows everything down. It prevents us at first from burning glucose. It later prevents us from burning fat. And so it's like, how do you keep that whole system moving? How do you keep the mitochondria, you know, running at an efficient clip, burning cleanly? You don't want to see a bunch of lactate in the bloodstream. You don't want to see elevated acylcarnitines, which is another sign that the mitochondria are not burning cleanly. And to me, it looks like the main limiting factor in doing all of that is, too much NADH and not enough NAD+. And so how do we get those things back? And I do think that, I don't entirely understand it. I think that ketosis itself can help raise the level of NAD+ compared to the level of NADH. And so I think that might be one of the mechanisms that makes keto effective. Like I say, I don't really understand why that is. But it seems to be an interesting phenomenon. But yeah, essentially in the mitochondria, the limiting factor becomes this ratio of NAD+ to NADH. And the reason is actually pretty simple. So as I've said, glucose and fat are all made into acetyl-CoA. That is the sort of the primary fuel that we're burning in the mitochondria. And each acetyl-CoA takes 3 NADH to burn completely. It has to offload 3 pairs of these electrons to be fully oxidized. And so the more NAD+ that's generated, and the lower NADH levels there are, the faster the metabolism will turn, and the more calories, really the more electrons will move through the system, because you have a place for them to go, right? The electrons from your food are transferred to NAD+. And if there's not enough NAD+, there's nowhere for the electrons from your food to go, and you're just kind of stuck there. And that's when you start doing de novo lipogenesis and all the other things. And so really what we want to be doing is keeping that whole process moving. And again, not to sound like a broken record, but one of the things that really bogs that process down is if we're burning too many unsaturated fats. They simply don't generate the amount of NAD+ that saturated fats do. And again, that also comes down to their lack of ability to generate reactive oxygen species. Reactive oxygen species ultimately result in the regeneration of NAD+. And the reason for that is that so glutathione is the main antioxidant that we use. And the enzyme called glutathione reductase actually uses NADPH, which is very similar to NADH, to get rid of the reactive oxygen species. And then that NADPH can just be switched out for an NADH, and it gives us an NAD+ back. And so, the way that the cell is designed to work, and now I'm even more convinced of this than ever, because I realize now that the carbohydrates are doing the same thing. They're also, pyruvate dehydrogenase is also cranking out hydrogen peroxide and superoxide, as is the electron transport chain when we burn saturated fats. So all of these processes create this steady stream of reactive oxygen species. As we detoxify those reactive oxygen species, we get back a constant stream of NAD+. And so that reactive oxygen species generation is a way of it's a way of getting rid of the extra electrons. That's what's happening, because every time that you make, I've said, okay, this acetyl CoA, it's got these 3 pairs of electrons that it needs to get rid of by transferring them to NAD plus before it's burned. And when those electrons come back out and form superoxide, well, that's one less electron. That's one less electron that has to be metabolized. And then when glutathione comes along and cleans up that electron, well, that gives us yet another NAD plus back. And so it's kind of like, think of ROS production as like a pressure relief valve that allows us to burn off these extra electrons, because the system has gotten overheated. There's too much fuel in the furnace, and so the body has ways of just simply getting rid of them. So we can, and what you see is that in response to a healthy person, as they eat more calories, their metabolic rate increases. That's what's supposed to happen. So if you start feasting, if you're metabolically healthy and you're eating the right fuels, like the people doing the Guru Walla, the more they eat, the more their metabolic rate increases. And then you see the opposite thing. The less that you eat, the more your metabolic rate decreases, right? Because we have this natural system that is designed to get rid of the extra calories. You blow off the extra electrons, that increases the amount that you're burning oxygen. It essentially increases calories out, but it's really electrons out. And that's how it's supposed to work, right? But then, then you eat a bunch of vegetable oil, and it breaks the system, because they're not participating in the generation of these reactive oxygen species. And so they're not, they don't quite work in the same way as saturated fat or as carbohydrates.
Okay, so I think you summarized it at the end really good. So what we can say is that basically we need to ensure that our electron transport chain, or the energy production, ATP production, is a smooth running machine, which actually has a release valve, ROS, which actually can then accommodate for increases of food by increasing or decreasing the metabolic rate, basically accordingly, and to its needs. Because I think at the end, and I don't know your opinion, that because you alluded to 3,000 calories before, which many people say, is that we don't really know at any point in time or day what are our metabolic needs, right? So you have more inflammation, you're tired, you did a strong training session, all these change your needs. So I think for me, making it in a simple coaching terms, I always try to say eat proper food until satiety, and that satiety will drive properly a healthy energy production system. Now you're actually kind of bringing more the science into it, that that satiety mechanism through saturated fat, but through carbs, is actually also a smooth mitochondria function, where it can actually blow steam off and adjust the metabolic rate. Did I translate it well, or? Yeah,
I think so. The only caveat of that is, the situation I was describing, of course, is in a healthy, lean person, and unfortunately, in this day and age, many of us are not that. And so the question is, can we get back to doing that efficiently? You can see, I mean, we've talked about it a lot, that in a lot of cases, just removing carbohydrates out of the equation is very healthy in someone who is maybe metabolically broken, and someone who has acetylated mitochondrial enzymes or whatever the problem is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really beneficial. And we sort of know that if that same person were to just eat a bunch of carbohydrates, they would probably continue down the same bad path that they were on, right? And so I'm arguing that in a healthy metabolism, you should be able to use those carbohydrates effectively. You should be able to burn them efficiently, and you should be flexible between the two. But the only question is how do we get unbroken once our metabolisms
So
are
how do
broken?
we get unbroken? Do we reduce calories, Brad?
What's that?
So I never so maybe you describe
Right.
1,600 calories as low, but I didn't actually say I don't say to any person that I work with and to this particular individual, eat less. I told him, eat as much as you can until you're satiated. Let's
Right.
say,
I think that's
right?
I think that's perfect advice. Because I think that purposefully restricting calories is ultimately not going to work, and lots of studies show that. And part of me thinks that, right, and as long as you're satiated with what you're eating, that's great. And I think that reducing carbohydrates for a lot of people helps trigger that satiety at a lower level for whatever reason that happens. And so, yeah, but right, I think how we
So what's the
ultimately fix
caveat?
it.
So you seem a bit in between.
So I don't want to, right. I think ultimately that calorie restriction has a lot of problems, right? Calorie, like I just said, calorie restriction leads to lower metabolic rate. Full stop.
Yeah.
And so I don't see how purposely restricting calories, whether or not it's from carbohydrates, whether it's from any source, is helpful, right? I mean, I think for small periods of time, it's good. I think intermittent fasting can be very helpful, but if we're, a lot of old school diets were like, okay, go down to 1,200 calories a day, go down to 800 calories a day, and they always fail because your metabolic rate just keeps decreasing and decreasing and decreasing and decreasing. And so what I'm thinking about in my research is how can we get that, fix the issue of our mitochondria being too high in NADH and too high in acetyl-CoA, and things are acetylated and they're not functioning. How do we get them running again, and able to process, get that metabolic flexibility back, able to process carbs, and able to process, fat once the blood sugar is lowered again, right? Which is what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to be able to switch back and forth. How do we do that? And I think the answer to that lies in fixing, the NADH levels and the acetyl-CoA levels in the mitochondria. And so that's where my thinking lies. And I think we need to figure out how to do that without necessarily restricting calories. That's my gut feeling. So it's just like you said, you should be able to eat to satiety. You have to be able to eat to satiety. If you don't, then if you try to starve yourself, I think you'll fail ultimately.
I've seen it many times actually, mostly with ladies.
Yeah.
Who have been doing yo-yo diets for years, and they try to lose some extra kilos they have, many or not many, doesn't really matter, by actually lowering their calories to less than 1,000 and trying to run as much as they can. And as soon as they actually start increasing their calories, 200 calories, 300 calories, whatever it may be, suddenly it seems like all of a sudden, by magic, their metabolism kicks in, and they're starting slowly to lose kilos because their system goes out of this emergency mode, right?
Right.
And that's I don't know if that's related to NADH ratios, but probably as well because I mean I actually believe on the restricted energy model, right? So that if the body goes into emergency mode, then it will start down regulating, which is actually reduce the metabolism, many functions, right? And then it will slow down also to the level you cannot actually burn. So as long as you get out of that emergency state, which maybe is NADH, lowering that NADH to NAD ratio, then you unblock again lipolysis maybe and fat burning.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think for sure that yeah, we should be eating to satiety, and I think I think the context at which you eat to satiety, by changing the the ratio of macros, or maybe doing some other things. There are different supplements that I've been playing around with to change the ratio of NAD plus to NADH, etc. And I think the context at which you're eating to satiety will change the number of calories that you eat. And I think that recently, so one of the things is that in terms of satiety is that a lot of us are leptin resistant. So leptin is this enzyme or hormone that signals satiety in the brain. It also increases metabolic rate by activating AMP kinase, etc. And a lot of people, to become obese, you almost sort of have to be leptin resistant. And there was a recent paper that showed that leptin doesn't work without SIRT1, which is a deacetylase enzyme, and it is reliant on NAD+, and it's blocked by NADH. And so even leptin, the main satiety hormone, is acting through the NADH to NAD+ ratio. And so that's and so if you can figure out how to change some of these underlying ratios like NAD+ to NADH, I think you will get natural satiety that a lot of people who are obese, I think, lack satiety. And I know that I always did. And now I feel like I'm much more in control of my hunger and my cravings, as opposed to when I was sort of out of control. I could just eat forever. So I think, it's like you say, it's like, I don't want to restrict calories. I think we should be eating to satiety, but the context in which you eat to satiety will sort of dictate the number of calories that you wind up consuming. I think, I guess, is how I would say it. Yeah.
And that's why I think keto works so well, right? Because you can. So so how many calories can you eat by having pasta in order to reach satiety, or a bag of chips? And how many steaks or calories can you eat to reach satiety with a steak?
Right.
So.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I think that's especially true, like I say, of people with a sort of broken metabolism. And so that's kind of, yeah. So I think there are ways, though, to, well, like I say, I'm curious. This is just part of my curiosity.
Since you're putting yourself in that category, right?
Right.
So how are you constructing your diet now? So, or personally, right? Not as a recommendation, but how would you construct an ideal diet for you, which then I assume includes carbs, but how would you actually get out of the obesity problem?
So what I'm attempting to do right now, and I've tried a whole bunch of different things, and with sort of I think I've seen small successes. I haven't had the complete and utter breakthrough yet. At the moment, I've been using some supplemental pyruvate, and that is, like I say, pyruvate is the thing that cells can take in, and they can offload extra electrons onto and convert it to lactate. And so the pyruvate kind of helps the cells offload some of their extra NADH. So that's the sort of kind of intervention that I've been doing to try to get out of, having that extra buildup of NADH. And then, I've been eating either like breakfast, I've been having some white rice with eggs. That's a very simple, it's very easy. It's a very easy breakfast. It's tasty. And then, for dinner, I might have some meat with, I've been eating, I make like a little simple potato turnip casserole that I like. It's very simple, and I'll have that with some meat. And so it's a pretty simple, and the sauce on that is not particularly heavy or anything. It's sort of just baked in milk and it's a really nice texture, and it's, and I don't have huge satiety problems with that. I think I would have back in the day, but as long as I'm using the pyruvate or other things to get to keep my NAD plus levels right, I feel like I can eat those things without a runaway appetite that I definitely used to have. And so, sure. And obviously still, like, the biggest things like pizza, I could easily eat, 3,000 calories of pizza in a sitting to this day. Right. And so, yeah. And so I think I can see it either way, because I can also easily eat like a pound of fatty steak in a sitting. And that's also a lot of calories. I think more than I would get out of the white rice and eggs. And so I think, in terms of calories, but again, I don't really care that much about calories. What I care about is making sure that the mitochondria are working effectively, because what I think is, if our mitochondria are running efficiently, the calories conversation will become a lot less important. I think if things are burning cleanly and burning effectively, then ultimately everything else will kind of find its way.
So how long does it take to balance out the system? So if you have high NADH, and I don't know if it can be measured actually. So
the simplest way would be a way to measure lactate and pyruvate, but that doesn't really exist. There's ways to measure it over the long term. You can do a blood test to look at your different fat ratios in your blood, like your desaturase index is an index of SCD1. There's another enzyme called delta 6 desaturase, and those enzymes are all running off of they're running off of NADH. And so if you have high NADH, those enzymes are going to be very active, and so they will convert certain fats to certain other fats, and you can kind of see the footprint of what they're doing. But that's a long-term, very indirect way of looking at NADH ratios.
So how, but so what's your feeling? So if you have high NADH, high ratio, so does it lower in a day, in a week, in a year, or what's the turnover?
So the NADH ratio can be altered, at least in the cytoplasm, can be altered quite quickly. Within probably minutes to hours. But how long does it take until your mitochondria are truly, totally deacetylated? There's a lot of changes that happen in obesity and diabetes. And so, and I'm talking about things like, oh, in addition to just the NADH, which is the short-term thing, then you have the next level is the buildup of acetyl-CoA. After that, you have the acetylation of all the mitochondrial enzymes. After that, you have things like regulation of enzymes that are involved in transcription factor, and they're doing things like upregulating glutathione, and so there's a lot of levels, right? And so you can fix the immediate cytoplasmic NADH to NAD plus ratio pretty quickly, like in minutes to perhaps an hour or two. But then how long does it take to trickle through all of those other levels? And then you have things like, at a very high end level, things like microRNAs that are regulating your mitochondria. You have hormones like cortisol, etc. And so I think getting the NAD plus ratio right in your cytoplasm is like the first level. And then I think if you keep that consistently right, all of those other things will slowly over time adjust themselves. But yeah, how long does this take? I'm not sure yet.
So is it maybe then on a very, again, going even higher level, so outside the mitochondria or outside the cell even, so that at the end the peak or the state is really insulin sensitivity, so that if you have an insulin of 5, for example, which then means that you probably are able to transport through the GLUT2 receptor glucose, then probably the cell, the mitochondria, are actually receptive to be able to accept, to use, to burn glucose more efficiently. So can we actually take it to a level or without going into the deep science of mitochondria, is there a metric you think that can help, so someone can go and do a simple blood test and say, okay, I am probably metabolically healthy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good one. I think looking at your level of glucose, your level of insulin compared to your level of glucose. There's a word for that ratio, but yeah, if you know your fasting blood glucose and your fasting insulin, that's a very good one, to see over time. I started and I had, whatever, my blood glucose was 100.
I think it's called HOMA-IR, right?
Yeah. And so yeah, no, I think that's a good ratio in the long term. I think also looking at your level of leptin is interesting. Like I say, obese and diabetic people are leptin resistant, so we have elevated levels of leptin. I think if you can see your level of leptin dropping, I think that's another good indicator that you're becoming more healthy. Yeah, those are definitely some good ones. I wish, like I said, I wish there was a better test to just test the kind of redox balance directly, but until that happens, yeah, I think and testing your cortisol level is another good one. I mean, cortisol can definitely sort of inhibit a lot of the things that insulin is doing. You kind of want low cortisol, low insulin, and low leptin. That's the ideal scenario. And so I will be testing those things going forward, as I try this new dietary path and see where things head. So yeah, stay tuned, I guess.
Exactly. Thank you very much. And maybe I just saw the hour, so the time, and it's really 90 minutes through now. So I don't want to take more of your time, but I think it was a nice chat for me, at least. I think we discussed a few things. I hope that our listeners also enjoyed it. And there are so many things that we need to wait for you to dig into the rabbit hole and provide us more insight and more great directions, because I think we need to understand our physiology, and we're still learning a lot. yeah, just counting calories cannot be the way, actually.
Right. I think so too. I think so as well. Yeah, no, and that was a great discussion. And yeah, like I say, I'm going to keep tinkering. So people can follow along at fireinabottle.net or I'm fire_bottle on Twitter. Those are my two main spots where I hang out.
I would totally recommend to everyone listening to us that you guys follow Brad and Fire in a Bottle. Great science, and actually science now that starts unfolding in an easy way as well. And that's my interest, to actually try to help you, maybe give you a few ideas so you can actually really, we're able to share it to everyone that is interested in making science easy and simple and understandable. So thank you very much, Brad.
Thank
Great
you.
stuff. And we'll for sure keep in touch, and we'll have soon another live to check your updates.
Sure. That sounds great.
Thanks very much, man.
All right.
Take care.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.